Welcome, everyone. Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And I'm so excited and delighted to have the opportunity to dialogue with one of the major research giants in the world and a world-class expert, the top guy in the entire world who's written more studies on this than anyone alive, Dr. Russel Reiter. And the topic we're going to be exploring on this area of expertise, which is melatonin. Now, Dr. Reiter has been around a long time. I saw him live for the first time like in 1995 in a presentation. That's almost 30 years ago, and he's still going strong. I think, Dr. Reiter, you have published, when I looked it up on PubMed, over 1,600 papers or somewhere in that range. Is that correct?
That's about in the ballpark, certainly.
Which is crazy. Dr. Mercola, I think he's got 600, but he hasn't been around as long as you have. So.
I have that advantage.
That's for sure. So we're going to talk about melatonin, which I think is the most profoundly exciting antioxidant in biology, and it's been around a long time. And as you bring out in your papers, over 3 billion years. It's present in the prokaryotes, which are bacteria,
Right.
And also, interestingly, it's in plants. And your lab actually discovered that in 1995 and brought it to our forefront. Now more research is done about melatonin in plants than there is in animals. So congratulations on that finding. And there's just so much I want to talk about, but let me, oh geez. Well, why is melatonin the best? Let's start with this. Why? Because people need to know what melatonin is, why it's so important. So it's a fundamental, foundational antioxidant. It's been the longest antioxidant on the planet. And, some people, and I mean, I had a question before, which is the more important antioxidant, melatonin or glutathione? And then it occurred to me after reading your papers that it's melatonin, clearly, because melatonin actually is responsible for stimulating the synthesis of glutathione.
That's true.
So why don't you just give us a little historical background so people can get up to speed about melatonin? And then I got so many specific detailed questions about how we can optimize this. Yeah. So there's no better person in the world to help us understand this than you.
Well, melatonin, as you say, has been here forever, even before I was born. And its functions have evolved, and it has worked. It has learned to work successfully with other molecules during this 3 billion year evolution. And of course, one of the molecules with which it collaborates is glutathione, and it does influence glutathione. But the antioxidant activity of melatonin is extremely diverse. Mm-hmm. It, in fact, is a very good radical scavenger. There are other radical scavengers, vitamin C, vitamin E, and so forth, but melatonin is superior to those. But beyond that, it stimulates antioxidative enzymes, especially in mitochondria. Mitochondria are small organelles in the cell that generate the bulk of the free radicals. So it's very important to have a good antioxidant at the level of the mitochondria. And melatonin happens to be located, and in fact, now we know synthesized in the mitochondria. Via that actions, melatonin, of course, scavenges radicals that are generated, but it also stimulates something called sirtuin-3, which activates or deacetylates superoxide dismutase, which is a very important antioxidative enzyme, and it also removes free radicals and prevents the degeneration of the mitochondria. And why this is so important is mitochondria are really the center of the action within a cell. In other words, there's strong evidence that aging, frailty of aging, senescence of cells as we age relate to molecular damage at the level of the mitochondria, and melatonin seems to be very efficient at protecting mitochondria from that damage.
So you mentioned that melatonin helps indirectly catalyze SOD through activating SIRT2 and SIRT3. But how does it increase glutathione? Does it just do it directly or indirectly? Does it activate it through a transcription factor like NRF2 pathway through the antioxidant response elements? Or I couldn't find that in the literature.
Yeah, well, certainly it's a genomic effect on the enzyme that regulates the synthesis of gamma-glutamyl cysteine synthase, is the rate-limiting enzyme in glutathione synthesis. And melatonin, of course, activates that enzyme, probably by a genomic effect, although those details are not completely known. But glutathione, I really have to estimate, is in very high concentrations in cells. And this is very, very important. The other thing that often confounds scientists is that the melatonin concentration is not that high within cells, with the exception of mitochondria. In other words, it is where the action occurs. And that's, I think, makes, and the diversity of functions as an antioxidant. It prevents free radical generation by enhancing the efficiency of the electron transport chain, so you get fewer electrons that leak onto oxygen molecules to generate superoxide anion radical. Like I say, it's really the diversity of actions. As I mentioned, throughout evolution, it is learned. It is learned to collaborate, to cooperate with other antioxidants and other molecules. Its functions are extremely diverse.
So when the glutathione is increased, and I'm sorry I'm just focusing on this, but it's such an important molecule, is the glutathione intracellular or mostly intramitochondrial?
It's intracellular primarily, although there's some also in the extracellular space, but it's primarily intracellular, and it's present in the mitochondria, but generally cytosolic glutathione is higher.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so the other, I've been a fan of sunshine for 3 decades. Probably more than that. And I just embrace it as one of the most fundamental principles that people can adopt, especially if they get the timing right and, optimizing circadian biology. But one of the reasons is that the major one that people think about the sun is ultraviolet B radiation to increase vitamin D levels. And that's absolutely understood. No one would dispute that. But what very few individuals appreciate, including most medical professionals, is that as I understand it, the near infrared and the red part of the spectrum, which is more than 40% of the wavelengths of the sun, are actually, when they're on the skin, go into the mitochondria, and they help the mitochondria generate melatonin. Do I have that right? Is that
you have that correct. That is a very important point in reference to mitochondrial melatonin. Near-infrared radiation penetrates relatively easily the skin and subcutaneous tissues. And of course, every one of those cells contains mitochondria, and it appears that near-infrared radiation that is detected in fact induces melatonin production. That is important because we now think that melatonin within mitochondria is inducible under a lot of stressful conditions. That is not definitively proven, but it appears that under stress, all cells may upregulate their ability to produce melatonin because it's so highly protective, and typically under stress, free radicals are generated. That is emphasized by the importance is that in the plants, we know exactly that happens. In other words, if you expose the plants to drought, to heat, to cold, to metal toxicity, the first thing they do is upregulate their melatonin, because all of those situations generate free radicals. And we suspect, although that has not yet been definitely proven, in animal cells as well, including human. And of course, you're right about near-infrared radiation. It penetrates the skin and it activates melatonin synthesis so far as we can tell. that's a very new field. I'm really pleased you mentioned it. And you're right. Very, very few people know this aspect of
Now, who uncovered this fact? Was it your lab?
Who uncovered it?
Yeah.
Scott Zimmerman. He's a lighting expert in New Jersey. He and I collaborated on a paper about 3 years ago where we explained this phenomenon. Subsequently, of course, others, Angie Slominski at the University of Birmingham, who's a skin expert, has looked at it. And there's a gentleman also in California by the name of Roger Seahold. I don't know if you know him.
Sure. Yeah. That's actually, he did he founded MedCram, and actually I posted his video on my site, and he was the guy that woke me up to this fact. I had no idea. Absolutely.
He did a really nice job in his presentation of this subject. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So I'd like to dive a little deep into, because I think this is such a fundamental importance. So is it just near infrared or red? And within that spectrum, I'm wondering if you know the specific frequency or wavelengths, that the range of wavelengths that might stimulate it.
Not within that range. Now, you have to understand that near infrared are the only wavelengths. Visible wavelengths generally do not penetrate the skin, so they cannot stimulate anything. The near infrared high energy waves are the ones that are more.
So it's a reflection of the ability to penetrate the skin,
That's right.
Okay, so it's probably 800 to 1100.
And why this is important is, of course, as you say, anytime you're in sunlight, you're exposed to near infrared. But in your office where you're currently sitting, or where I am, there's no near infrared. So I think generally humans are relatively melatonin deficient because we do not experience enough sunlight. And even though within the pineal gland, darkness associates or causes the synthesis of melatonin only in the pineal gland, our nights, because people are sleeping less and less, are becoming shorter and shorter. So we're depriving ourselves of a very fundamental and important molecule with our lifestyle.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's really one of the molecules if we value our health, we need to seek to optimize the level of melatonin, no question. So along those lines, I just want to confirm, you probably, if you're out in the sun with a long sleeve shirt and pants on, you'll probably get some near infrared that penetrates the clothing, but not as much as if you were in no shirt or sports bra and shorts, I would suspect.
That's true.
Okay, so I just want to confirm that. All right. So, and then addressing your point of inside, that doesn't have to be, but is the reality in most everyone's circumstance, because the type of glass that's used is typically low E glass, which shields out almost all the infrared, not 100%, but a good portion of it. So you're essentially, if you're in an office, even with the entire office's windows, unless it's a no E glass, you're not going to get infrared. So what I do to compensate for that, I have a near infrared bulb, basically a sauna space heat lamp bulb, about 250 watts. And I just keep it on when I'm in my office and have my shirt off. Yes. So I'm getting near infrared for sure.
Good for you. Like I say, I think we have altered our environment so much unwittingly without knowing the physiological and health consequences thereof. You have to remember, I always remind people that we evolved for 3 or 4 million years in an environment where we had sun exposure. Mm-hmm. And now it's estimated that humans spend less than 10% of their time outside. Yeah. In other words, they're almost always under artificial light, and it's just not the same.
100%. That's why, as I said at the beginning, what's one of my most fundamental foundational principles to optimize your health is you need to be in the sun at least an hour a day, preferably with as little clothing as possible. Obviously, it's not going to be as easy in the winter, which is why it makes more sense to live in subtropical areas. Like you're in Texas, I'm in Florida, so you can do it most of the year. So now I want to dive into the more details about melatonin, because essentially there's two types. There's the type produced that's intravascular from the pineal gland in your blood, and the type that's subcellular in the melatonin that we just discussed. So interestingly, and you made it really clear in your research that you've done, that if you produce, and I was confused on this until I reread your articles, not all of them, but 1,600 articles will take a long time to go through all the studies you wrote. But the melatonin that your mitochondria produces does not escape the mitochondria or the cell. It doesn't go into the blood. So you're not going to increase blood levels or serum levels of melatonin by sun exposure. That has to be through pineal gland and through optimization.
That's absolutely. In other words, if you surgically remove the pineal gland from an animal or from a human, it's rarely done in humans unless it's cancerous, blood levels of melatonin are essentially zero. Not totally zero. Mm-hmm. I think what happens is that the other cells, obviously, or the mitochondria in other cells continue to produce melatonin, and some of it leaks out into the blood and gives you a residual. But you have no circadian rhythm. Melatonin production in the pineal gland is highly rhythmic depending on the light-dark cycle. This is not true for melatonin in mitochondria. It's not cyclic. It's not impacted by the light-dark environment. It may be affected by certain wavelengths of energy, but it's not affected by the light-dark environment. So everything you have said is valid. Blood levels are derived from the pineal gland, and this rhythm is very important for setting circadian rhythms. In other words, the function of that rhythm or that melatonin is quite different from the function of the mitochondrial produced melatonin. It sets a rhythm. Of course, there's always some scavenging by that melatonin as well, but the real scavenging really undergoes or is involved with mitochondrial produced melatonin.
Okay. Now, the converse situation is that the melatonin produced by your pineal gland in your blood can go into the mitochondria because I believe there's some active transport mechanisms that's responsible for that.
Very good. You are really up on it. That's true. If you supplement with melatonin, it can also enter cells and get into the mitochondria as well. And that is also very important, particularly, and I'm not telling your clientele to take melatonin during aging, but as you age, pineal melatonin, and so far as we know, mitochondrial melatonin diminish. And if you supplement with melatonin, it will get into your mitochondria and, in fact, do what melatonin does: neutralize free radicals and protect the mitochondria function.
So we'll get into supplementation later because I have a lot of questions on that too. Very important, but I want to still go into the waters and set the physiology and understand the basic mechanisms of melatonin. And along those lines, I couldn't find anywhere in the research, and I'm sure you know or have an idea, with respect to the quantity. So you've got the amount produced by the pineal gland. Can you speculate as to the level quantitatively that's produced by the pineal gland relative to the cumulative amount that's produced by the mitochondria subcellularly?
We have speculated on this. Again, it's difficult to specifically define, but we feel that the pineal gland probably produces 5% or less of the total melatonin in the body. It's a very small organ. It's primarily produced at night. Every other cell in your body has mitochondria and presumably are capable of synthesizing melatonin. So the amount produced by the pineal gland is very small, but the rhythm that it produces is very important to regulate your circadian biology. And we are circadian organisms, obviously.
Yes, so that would make sense because the pineal gland is about the size of a pea or a small marble. And then you've got, I think the latest stats I remember were like 40 to 100 quadrillion, not trillion, quadrillion mitochondria, because every cell contains hundreds, if not thousands, in some cells, maybe even millions of mitochondria. So, definitely more.
this is also, you're absolutely right. Mitochondria can be very numerous in some cells, especially in cells that require a lot of high energy. In other words, the heart. The heart is pumping, and 40% of the volume of the cytosol is occupied by mitochondria in these cells, whereas much less so in other cells. And that implies also that the heart melatonin concentration would be higher. They have more mitochondria that produce it. And of course, they are producing more free radicals because the ATP that is produced to cause, of course, contraction of the heart. So all these things are relevant for sure.
So I think thank you for expanding on that. We can dive now into some of the diseases that melatonin appears to be useful for. And the two biggest diseases that humanity faces right now would be heart disease and cancer. So let's start. You mentioned heart disease or heart. So let's talk about the therapeutic implications of optimizing melatonin concentrations to address heart disease.
Well, of course, one of the situations that is most devastating to the heart, of course, is temporary interruption of the blood supply. In other words, cardiac arrest. Mm-hmm. This deprives, of course, tissues of oxygen, and without oxygen, they do not function. And then when the blood vessel opens, it's called reperfusion, and oxygen flows into those deprived cells, and as a consequence, they generate a lot of free radicals. There's a host of studies, a large host of studies, including some in the human, where if you give melatonin to induced heart attack in animals or an accidental heart attack in humans, you can preserve or reduce the amount of cardiac infarct, the amount of damage that occurs in the heart. There's a very famous cardiologist in the Canary Islands, Professor Dominguez Rodriguez, who I work with. And we, about 3 years ago, published a paper where we infused melatonin directly into the heart after the vessel was opened. And of course, that reduced cardiac damage by roughly, I think it was 40%. And now we've just published a paper. The other thing that happens in a heart attack is cardiac cells do not regenerate. Once you lose a cardiac cell, they're done. A lot of cells, liver can regenerate a whole liver. But heart, once you lose cells, they're damaged and replaced by fibrous tissue. And of course, fibrous tissue is not contractile, so you get heart failure. We just published a paper, again, with this same cardiologist showing that if people who are potentially suffering with heart failure because of a damaged heart, they survive better and longer if they are given melatonin on a regular basis. It's a small study. It's only been done this one time, but I think that would be a worthwhile field to really exploit.
Well, you've addressed two really important areas, the post-MI syndrome and then heart failure, which is pervasive in the United States. So let's address the heart attack element first. What type, I suspect most of the studies were done in animals, but then probably a few clinical trials. What is the typical dosages of supplemental melatonin that were being used? Ideally per milligram per kilogram, I would suspect.
That's a very good question. In terms of animals, now this dose is going to sound high, but it's difficult to translate doses in animals to doses in the human. 5 to 10 milligrams per kilogram body weight. But when you calculate the dose on the human basis, you calculate on the basis of surface area rather than on body size, and that significantly reduces the amount of melatonin that you have to give. How much would you have to give if I had a heart attack and I had melatonin on my person? I would take melatonin. The question is how much?
Right.
Of course, we don't precisely know, but when we infused it directly into the heart, of course, we had to infuse much less because it went directly to the heart. Sure. But I would think, again, this is not a recommendation to any of your patients, but I think I would not be hesitant about taking 50 milligrams at the time, and some subsequently for the next 24 hours, even during the day, because you don't want to lose any more heart cells than is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, that's a good point. It just occurred to me that I don't really know what the half-life of melatonin is. What is it?
Well, the half-life of melatonin in the blood, and that's the point. I'm glad you mentioned that. The half-life of melatonin in the blood is about 40 minutes.
Wow.
However, within cells, the half-life varies according to the oxidative stress that is ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
If there's high oxidative stress, it's destroyed much faster. And if it's low oxidative stress, it stays within the cell much longer. In reference to that, I want to also mention, and you probably know this, not only is melatonin a scavenger, but all of its metabolic kin, N-acetyl 5-methoxytryptamine, all these molecules that are produced when it scavenges are likewise scavengers. It's a generational effect. In other words, melatonin's children, its grandchildren also are, in fact, good radical scavengers. So the half-life you have to define on the basis of where you're talking about.
Well, so what would you guess the effective half-life of melatonin and its active metabolites are?
Well, I think under conditions of high oxidative stress, they're very short because it's
so minutes.
very relative, rapidly utilized.
Yeah.
For example, we did some experiments before we discovered melatonin as an antioxidant. We didn't understand. In animals that are nocturnal, they are active at night, and if you force them to swim, that's a big stress for these rodents. And what happens under these conditions is melatonin levels disappear from the blood, even though the pineal gland, on the basis of the enzyme, are producing a lot of melatonin. But it's being very rapidly taken up and metabolized within the cell because of the intense stress and free radicals associated with that maneuver. So, like I say, at any particular time, the half-life of melatonin will vary according to the circumstances.
And how long does it take for melatonin to enter the bloodstream once you swallow it?
Very quickly. In other words, the thing you have to consider, of course, is the first pass effect. In other words, if you swallow melatonin, like everything else that absorbed, it goes through the liver, and the function of the liver is to metabolize melatonin as well. So the bioavailability of melatonin that is swallowed is less than melatonin where you take it under the tongue, sublingual, or if you take it intravenously, because you avoid that first pass effect. So, but melatonin gets into the system very, very quickly.
What about rectally?
Say again?
Rectally, like a suppository.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, there was a gentleman, I forgot his name, 5 years ago, who contacted me about rectal suppositories. So far as I know, the only size available in rectal suppository, but you may know otherwise, are 250 milligrams.
No, you can make them yourself, whatever dose.
Well, of course you can. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that would avoid the lower intestine. The blood does not initially go through the liver, and therefore you would get higher bioavailability by a rectal suppository. And I think it'd be also very rapid.
Okay. So I didn't forget about the application of melatonin for heart failure, and because I'm really curious as to the dosing. Well, actually, before we go to the heart failure, because it's so rapidly absorbed, especially if you're doing sublingual, the first sign of a heart attack, this should be probably the standard of care, standard operating procedure, is to give someone 50 milligrams to 100 milligrams of melatonin as soon as possible, and then probably repeat it every few hours.
In fact, I have suggested this a number of times. In other words, an emergency medical technician goes out, picks up a patient who has clearly a heart attack. Gotcha. I think on site, immediately melatonin should be given even intravenously. rather than even
we make
it made it be difficult to give it orally. So you give it that would be my recommendation. There's no proof of concept yet that would be adequate, but certainly in animal studies, you greatly reduce the damage the sooner you get the melatonin in. And as you mentioned, thereafter also, because reperfusion is just as bad as the ischemia. Reperfusion injury is just
worse. It's worse, isn't it?
Yeah, in some cases it's worse. Absolutely right.
So along those lines, and I hesitate to bring it up, but it fits perfectly in with this conversation, because another valuable, I consider supplement, even though technically it's a drug, it's the oldest drug that we know of. It was discovered in 1876. It's methylene blue. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but
methylene blue, I know. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it is just absolutely phenomenal for reperfusion injuries if you do it right at the beginning, because it goes in there and it augments all those cytochromes and essentially allows the continued production of ATP without the use of oxygen. Because I mean, if you block those, like with a poison, like cyanide, it will save your life. It's actually in almost every emergency room too, just for that reason, for cyanide poisoning. So it seems like methylene blue and melatonin are the 1-2 punch if you've got a stroke or a heart attack.
Again, I'm not an expert on methylene blue, but I know of its beneficial effects. You mentioned something very important. If you give cyanide, of course, that's a mitochondrial toxin. There was a study already 12, 15 years ago showing that. Now, it's only one study. I'd like to see it repeated. But there's also evidence that cyanide poisoning, if you take melatonin, you may also prevent cell death.
Wow. That's crazy. Because, I mean, cyanide blocks cytochrome 4, I believe.
I think, for example, methamphetamines, these illicit drugs are very hard on the brain. And I'm certainly not encouraging people to take methamphetamines, but if they do, they should take it in combination with melatonin. There are studies by very reputable neurological scientists showing that the toxicity of methamphetamines is reduced by melatonin. Like I say, I'm not even suggesting that methamphetamine be taken, but you could protect some of your brain cells from damage.
It's interesting artifact. We do not want to give this podcast a reputation for
exactly. Yeah, I understand that.
For recreational drug use.
No, I understand that. You can cut all that stuff out.
No, it's fine. But it's an interesting observation. Very fascinating. But this is I wasn't aware of the benefit of melatonin reperfusion injuries like it was methylene blue, but boy, it seems like they're the perfect combo. They should be part of every emergency kit. That is crazy.
Yeah, it's never been tried in combination so far as I know, and I agree with you.
Yeah,
it would be very worthy studies to carry out in humans because they're non-toxic molecules.
All right, so that's for acute reperfusion injury primarily. Now, stroke, I'm assuming you would agree would be included with the post-heart attack because they're almost identical. One is affecting the brain, the other is affecting the heart.
Right.
Yeah.
So no different for the brain. Ischemic reperfusion and your stroke.
That's what I'm saying. It's the same darn thing.
Very similar mechanisms. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, but getting back to heart failure, which is more of a chronic condition than an acute, like a reperfusion. So, what are the doses? And I know you said it was a small study, clinical trial, but I'm wondering what the dosing would be there. Would it be similar to that for the reperfusion injury?
Yeah, it was 10 milligrams per day for the heart failure study prolonged. Yeah, again, doses we don't precisely know.
Yeah, it's a range
because there's not enough clinical trials. But I guess my comment would be any melatonin is good melatonin. In other words, it's never going to do any serious harm. There are people who say they have a headache, some dizziness, but if you give 50 people water, but tell half of them that they got a specific drug, 30% of that half will have some physiological consequences.
Yeah, it's called, depending on which perspective you look at, either the placebo or the nocebo effect. Yeah, exactly. It's well documented. Yeah,
exactly.
So interesting. So now one side effect that I was concerned about, and I definitely wanted to discuss it with you, especially in light of the dosing recommendations of supplementation for melatonin, would be the concern that many people, clinicians have of high doses of melatonin that have the ability to somehow chelate or take out heavy metals in the body and or extract them in some way. And I'm not sure of the mechanisms, but I know it's a concern. It's heavy metal toxicity. So unless you're addressing it with some type of heavy metal binder, you could have some potential complications. And I'm wondering what your experience with that is.
Yeah, I think it is important, particularly with high doses, whatever a high dose constitutes, that we exercise care because we don't know. Mm-hmm. We do know that very high doses of melatonin given to animals, they shrug it off. In other words, there's never been a death in animals associated with giving too much melatonin, even though attempts have been tried.
Wow.
Every drug has what is called an LD50. Right. If you give a dose high enough to kill 50% of the animal, melatonin, there is no LD50. That doesn't mean it's always safe at very high doses. The point you measured about chelating metals may be, in fact, valid. But typically, in most cases, melatonin is taken in the short term, in high doses. Although there are many people who take melatonin, I think
like you.
Yeah. I don't know if you realize that I was shocked by this. In 2021, the amount of money spent on melatonin was 780 billion, not million.
Wow.
700.
Wow.
And they estimate by 2025. I'm sorry, not billion. I'm so very sorry.
Million.
780 million. And by 2025, it will be $1.2 billion.
That's a lot. And that has got to bring an incredible smile to you.
Yeah.
I mean, just because you're largely responsible for that.
Well, yeah, I should have a vested interest in melatonin, but
I should be giving you a commission.
In reference to high doses, I want to point something out. I have colleagues who work with melatonin, who are scientists like I am, very good friends. Mm-hmm. Two of them have diabetes. Diabetes is a very bad disease. Hyperglycemia produces massive amounts of free radicals. Even if you're on insulin, you're hyperglycemic sometimes. To counter this, listen to this carefully, they take 1 gram of melatonin daily. 1 gram of melatonin.
Wow. Because of their diabetes.
Yeah, because there's so many side effects in terms of atherosclerosis.
I could think, I mean, that's okay with melatonin, but there's so many better things that you could treat. Melatonin doesn't treat the cause.
Yeah.
It's metabolic inflexibility primarily. So, but it does protect the side effects pretty well.
Yeah. I don't know if 1 gram is necessary, but
that's what they're doing.
But it's what they do because they have such confidence. You know, in reference to that, people say, when they talk about melatonin, sometimes you hear people say 50 milligrams, that's such a high dose for an antioxidant. I remind them that Linus Pauling, when he was working with vitamin C, he suggested up to 4 grams of vitamin C daily. So, you know, doses are still unknown.
Yeah, I actually take, let me see, 50, I take about 4 or 5 grams a day of vitamin C, but it's whole food vitamin C. It's the whole molecule from, my source is acerola cherries that grow in my front yard. So I get about 4 or 5 grams a day. but I don't take ascorbic acid at all. I would only take ascorbic acid, which is people confuse with vitamin C. It's not. It's a synthetic derivative molecule, and it's very effective. It's like a drug. It really can save your life in septic shock. But I wouldn't take it as a daily supplement. I would take the whole food vitamin C. But you're right. It's in much higher doses. So, but I thank you so much for bringing up the lethality of it. So it kind of reminds me of Dr. Jonathan Wright, who said that when he was talking about vitamin B12, that another natural molecule, that the pretty much the only way you can die from B12 is if you drown in a bathtub full of it, because it's just no known toxicity. So it sounds like there's no known toxicity, no lethal dose that's ever been identified for melatonin.
I've made that comment also, that more people die from electric or
lightning
than they do from melatonin, and that is extremely rare.
Well, does there any been any reported deaths from melatonin?
Well, unfortunately, in the last couple of months, there's been some really foolish reports claiming that 5 children out of many, many thousands that were given melatonin reportedly died of melatonin.
Wow.
But there is no proof of that. In other words, if you look at the data carefully, they may have been taking other medications. They measured the melatonin levels in these individuals, and they range from 5 to 1,400 picograms per milliliter. So there was no uniformity in circulating melatonin. And they were not specific about how the melatonin was ingested, time of day, and so forth. In other words, I'm very doubtful of the findings.
It would seem unlikely with not being able to reproduce that in animals at all.
And again, I don't want to mean melatonin is always perfect. It's a good, wholesome molecule, and there may be some situations we may discover where it's not appropriate. But
I'm sure that's the case. Yeah, we don't know what we don't know.
We have currently a paper in press, for example, where we showed that in animals, Zika virus toxicity is also prevented by melatonin. And we've checked 4 different coronaviruses in pigs, and that paper is already published also, showing that melatonin prevents the damage that consequence of those viruses. I think that's generally a quite good antiviral agent and should be considered as a useful.
You are the world expert in melatonin. There's no one that exceeds your knowledge on the topic. So it would seem that a once a day dosing would be relatively foolish, with considering its short half-life. So as a world-class expert, what would you propose as a better physiological dosing strategy, and what would be the route of administration? Sublingual. I mean, I guess maybe it depends on the severity of the illness. I mean, if the person's on a ventilator, then you may want to make an IV, of course. But in general, an ambulatory outpatient.
Well, the route of administration, if you're going to self-administer, has to be simple. In other words, it can't be intravenously or even rectally. It wouldn't be very easy, but I would say oral-based melatonin, swallow or sublingual. How often should you take it? I mentioned that, of course, in the blood, the half-life is 40 minutes, but in the cell, it's significantly longer depending on the circumstances. We have suggested on some occasions that melatonin be taken, of course, at bedtime, and then at the time of awakening, and at 10 a.m. and at 4 p.m. Now, this, again, is not a recommendation to your people, but this is something to consider, that melatonin.
That makes more sense. So keep it away from noon when theoretically solar noon. So that would be like in your daylight savings time, right. 1 p.m. So that would be the theoretical lowest point of your melatonin in your blood, because that's when it's maximally suppressed.
Yeah, very low. Yeah, circulating melatonin during the day is negligible.
Yeah. So that's really good. So question about the nighttime dose. saying you're doing sublingual, is it sufficient to do it right before you go to bed, or but might it be a bit more optimal to do it half hour or even 45 minutes to an hour before you go to bed, just to give it time to get into the circulation?
In fact, that's exactly what I do. My first dose of melatonin is about 45 minutes before I want to go to sleep. And then I divide my dose in even. Then the second dose is about 15 to 20 minutes, 15 minutes before I want to go to sleep. So yeah, I do exactly what you say. I divide that dose and give it advance of the time I want to go to sleep.
All right. And so your dose is oral, I'm assuming, or is it timed release, or what are you using?
Oh, what am I doing? I happen to use a sublingual dose of melatonin. You say sublingual, but when you put it on your tongue and it dissolves, you're also swallowing because it stimulates salivary production. So you're getting both sublingual and
oral,
orally administered melatonin. But I think there are a lot of different preparations that are available. There are slow release, there are retarded release, and I'm sure some of them have utility. They just have not been tested as extensively.
Okay. So that's interesting. So, and I think we can go into your actually, before we go into your specific dosing, we'll get back to that. We didn't address the biology of this second, kind of going to rapidly to the number one leading cause of death in the United States and worldwide, which would be cancer. So melatonin has some very intriguing benefits. And I read your spectacular article on this. You published so many, but this one was about 3 years ago, where you go into how it impacts the Warburg effect. And so maybe you can review that. Basically, anaerobic glycolysis, where you can't shuttle the pyruvate back into the mitochondria because it inhibits it with PDK.
Cancer cells are clever.
Yeah,
they do everything they can to permit their continued survival. One of the things they do is, it seems counterintuitive, but what they do is they prevent pyruvate from entering the the mitochondria, and that reduces ATP production. But as a consequence of doing that, they accelerate something called glycolysis, and that's very inefficient in producing ATP, but it does it very rapidly. So then they have sufficient energy to take on this. The important feature of preventing pyruvate from entering the mitochondria, we now think, is the fact that pyruvate is a precursor to something called acetyl coenzyme A. Acetyl coenzyme A is a cofactor for the enzyme that regulates melatonin production in the mitochondria. So by eliminating or preventing pyruvate from getting into the mitochondria, they prevent or reduce melatonin production because they don't allow the necessary cofactor to be produced. In other words, we predicted about 4 years ago that, in fact, the mitochondria of cancer cells would produce less melatonin. We have subsequently shown that in 2 studies, both uterine cancers, but clearly melatonin levels and the activity of the enzymes in the mitochondria of these type cancer cells, at least, are about half what they would normally be. The prevention of pyruvate into the mitochondria, that's Warburg type metabolism. And of course, they produce a lot of it. And the other thing that does is the pyruvate is metabolized as something called lactic acid. It escapes the cell and produces an acidic environment for the cancer cell, and cancer cells like that acidic environment. So in fact, there are many things that if you can reduce the Warburg type metabolism, you may be able to limit the growth of cancer cells and perhaps also the metastasis. Metastasis, of course, is what typically kills the patient, as opposed, I mean, you don't want a primary tumor either, but if you can reduce metastasis, it would be.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The paper that I read of yours, you had mentioned that there was the Warburg effect wasn't present at nighttime. It was only present in the daytime when melatonin levels were low. But I think it was an in vivo study that was you referenced, and but when nighttime came around, the Warburg effect stopped, and it appeared to be related to the melatonin levels.
Yeah, the point of that paper was that some cancer cells may only be part-time cancerous, because when they have high melatonin, then they avoid Warburg-type metabolism. The interesting thing about Warburg-type metabolism, people usually equate it to cancer, but many pathological cells, inflammatory cells, cells that are affected by amyloid beta in the brain, they all exhibit this specific type metabolism, which is generally considered to be a pathological type metabolism. And presumably, we already know that inflammatory cells, they're called M2 and M1 inflammatory cells, they can be converted back and forth by melatonin. The inflammatory cell can be prevented by giving them with melatonin and its effect on Warburg type metabolism. So Warburg type metabolism is common in many, many pathological cells.
Yes. So as you were describing that, it occurred to me that an interesting observation, I'd like your feedback on it, but I just want to expand on the pyruvate a little bit, because many people may not understand that the glucose or sugar, of course, is one of the primary fuels that most people have. In fact, the majority of people that uses their primary fuel. But when you there's this glucose is metabolized is a 6 carbons, is metabolized to a 3 carbon molecule, which is pyruvate, and that's the molecule you were talking about. And it then ultimately gets metabolized in the mitochondria to acetyl-CoA. But the problem with the Warburg effect, that was the most elegant description of the Warburg effect I've ever heard. I never really got the Warburg effect until you explained it so well in that paper. But essentially, you have this pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase, PDK, that inhibits the inflow of pyruvate into the mitochondria so it be converted. But so that's one source. The other source of fuel is glucose to pyruvate to make acetyl-CoA, which is so important for producing melatonin. But the other source is fatty acid oxidation, which breaks it right down to acetyl-CoA, and it goes into the mitochondria pretty seamlessly through, I think, MCT, monochain chain. I forget what it is. It's a transport. It's active transport to get it into the mitochondria.
Thank you for mentioning that. You're right. Acetyl-CoA is generated by fatty acids.
But here's the point, the epiphany, the light bulb moment I had when we were discussing it. Just last week, there was a study out of Tufts. And you may not be aware of this, because, I mean, we knew it was high, but this is brand new. 14 out of 15 people in the United States, 93%, are metabolically inflexible. In other words, they have lost the ability to seamlessly transition between burning carbohydrate as fuel and converting to pyruvate to converting fat as a fuel. So they are just impaired. So the vast majority of the population, this Warburg effect becomes massive. But if you're healthy, cardiometabolically healthy, and you can burn fat, you kind of bypass that defect. So I think that's one of the reasons why, we're so damn sick, is because we've lost the ability to burn fat and to generate this acetyl-CoA, which is so important to create melatonin.
Thank you for telling me that. I wonder if you would be willing to email that reference to me. I have not seen that.
Yeah, it was very, very important. Yeah, it was the best reference we had before that was an N. Haynes study published in 2016. So it was already 6 years old. And that reference was 88%. Now it's up to 93%. That is just shocking. Probably it's on its way to 95%. Right. Hardly anyone's healthy anymore. It's crazy.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
I'll be glad to send that to you. Okay, so that we've covered that up. So, this is so important. So, we didn't really cover it completely, because I'm curious as to your thoughts you've given your recommendations therapeutically, at least, but it would seem, especially, I guess it's a tough answer because the question it depends on the person. But if you're elderly, I'd say over 60, and the older, the more important it becomes, it makes sense to, from your perspective, to take a higher dose, not only to optimize melatonin levels, prevent free radical damage, but to sort of serve as, especially if you're metabolically inflexible, as some of your colleagues are doing for treating their diabetes, is to have this relatively high level continuously, ideally probably taken right before bedtime and maybe at 10 in the morning, at 4 p.m. as supplemental doses because of the short half-life, just to address these concerns and help limit the likelihood that you're going to have a cancer.
Surely, you're right. Typically, we suggest that with increasing age, the dose of melatonin be improved.
Increased,
improved, or increased at least. And the other issue I'm often asked is, at what age, if you're going to supplement with melatonin, at what age should you initiate that? We've discussed this frequently, and it probably varies according to the individual, in as much as with everything else, there are genetic differences in the amount of melatonin individuals produce. Like thyroid, there's hyperthyroidism, there's hypothyroidism. There are cases of hypomelatonism where, at least based on a nocturnal rise in melatonin, there are some people who are not producing as much melatonin. And maybe this is related to rate of aging. And in fact, those individuals may begin supplementation early. Now, it's very difficult to find your own melatonin levels because you have to get the nighttime values. Mm-hmm. You have to get the nighttime values in darkness. If you go to your physician and you say, measure my melatonin, we'll all have low melatonin levels. So there is that issue. But generally, we agreed that maybe 40 to 45, you should begin supplementing with small amounts of melatonin. Again, not a recommendation, but something we've discussed. And as you get older, progressively more.
Yeah. So is this an assay that can be done in a commercial laboratory like Quest or LabCorp?
Say again?
The melatonin levels, can that be done in a commercial lab?
Yeah, there's a number of labs. There are now even some hospitals where the clinical chemistry is including melatonin because it's becoming such a big deal. But yeah, there are a number of clinical labs where this can be done. But again, that's not within 2 hours. You mail it there, and a week later you get the results and so forth. But there are more and more labs and clinical chemistry units now measuring melatonin.
Does it require special processing? Because
no, it's very simple.
You don't have to freeze it or anything.
It's like practically any clinical chemistry procedure. It's all automated and very simple to do now.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. I heard listening to one of your podcasts where you referencing the challenges of assaying melatonin levels when you first started your research. And you had these very indirect methods of pencil fish to
the pencil fish.
Very crude at best.
Very at best it was very crude.
Yeah. So it's a lot easier nowadays. Yeah. All right. So I guess we could dive into what, people, you've had 1,600 papers. You started your research, and I think your first paper was published in 1964. So people probably know you've been around for a while. You've been doing this. No, your PhD was 64, but you probably published that paper too. So you're doing this almost 60 years. So you're up there. You're 85, 86 years old now?
I'm 86 years old.
Yeah. So and you probably have the best mental acuity per age of anyone I've ever interviewed. And I've interviewed people over close to 100. Really good researchers like Fred Kumaro. I think maybe he was 99 when I interviewed, maybe, or 100. It was really close. He was good, but not as sharp as you. And I think, relatively speaking, I'm really impressed with your mental acuity because, especially looking at our current presidents, it's like, you're 7 year seniors too. So,
yeah, I've been taking melatonin for 28 years. Again, that implies or that has been beneficial. I can't prove that since I have no control. But I am hopeful that taking the melatonin will preserve some of my neurons and other cells as well to allow me to continue for, I don't know how soon I'll consider retiring, but it's not yet on the horizon.
That's good. That's good. That retirement is I think an early 20th century anachronism that's really out of place now. I don't think anyone should ever retire, because the moment you do, the likelihood that you're accelerating more rapidly towards your premature demise is just increased pretty dramatically, because you've got to be involved in your passion. You need to be something that excites you about life every day. And, just to go and sit on the beach and drink margaritas is not going to cut it. You want to do that short term, fine, but that's not or play golf, that gets old real quickly.
It's interesting you mentioned that. That's one thing. That's one reason I'm frightened of retiring.
Yeah. You should be. It's a death sentence for most people.
People retire in my mind, to die.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That is not my plan. But yeah, good. There are no guarantees, obviously, but
yeah. So okay, so we gave it the context for you're taking the melatonin, but I think you're taking about 100 milligrams. Why don't you tell us precisely what?
Right now it's around 80, but you're right. I've taken as much as 300, but right now it's right around 80 per day.
And you divided
dose, as I mentioned.
Okay, are you doing the 10 a.m., 4 p.m., and then
only occasionally, minutes? Depending upon, if I have a condition where I think free radicals are involved, I would take it during the day. I do not routinely at this point take it during the day.
Oh, so only if it's an acute scenario would you take it 3 times a day? Okay, that makes sense. Boy, I'm telling. I am so excited to have this connection with you and really go into the details and understand the pharmacokinetics of the melatonin, so that you can optimize the dosing of this incredibly important therapeutic molecule. I mean, it's just shocking. It's so underutilized.
Yeah, I think so underutilized. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that methylene blue, I mean, those are the two gifts. I mean, you got to have these two. They got to be in your emergency kit for sure. I mean, and interesting thing about both of them.
Yeah.
They are cheap as can be. I mean, they're not expensive. They're almost free.
Yeah. They've never been combined in the tests that I know of.
Yeah. Well, it's just so obvious. They're both beautifully. They have similar mechanisms in some not really, but they work well. They're a powerful synergistic component. So, wow. So now I think I've covered most of my question. I wondered if you think I've left anything out, or anything important that you'd like to mention that I neglected.
Well, other than there are many, many, many diseases that have a free radical basis or oxidative stress basis. And of course, also aging is very much linked to failure of your mitochondria. Mm-hmm. So anything you can do to maintain functional mitochondria will preserve your cells and prevent their senescence. So again, melatonin is lost as you age.
Yeah.
And so you're losing your best defense against aging. Best defense. You're losing a very good defense against aging when your melatonin levels diminish.
Yeah, and that's why I'm such a big fan of methylene blue. At a low dose, so we're talking somewhere about 20 to 30 milligrams a day, which is relatively tiny, pretty similar to, I guess with many respects to the melatonin dose. But I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but at those doses, it's speculated to increase mitochondrial efficiency, ATP production by 30%. 30%. It's crazy. It's just a free 30%. I will send. I interviewed Francisco Gonzalez Lima, who's not. I don't, you might be aware of him. He's in Texas. Maybe which Texas University?
I think he's at Houston. I think he's at Houston, Baylor.
I thought he was Austin. But I don't know. But he's definitely at the University of Texas, no question. I will send you the interview that I did with him and some more details just for the methylene, because I think I think you benefit from it. I really do. And it's just a crazy good
I would like to see that.
Yeah. And as I said, I think a 4-year supply is like $17. So 4 years.
That's the other advantage that these molecules have.
So this is outrageously great. I'm just so happy to make the connection with you and just so appreciate all the hard, persevering work you've done in helping bring this magnificent molecule to greater awareness. And congratulations on being such a huge influence on radically increasing its use in the last year or two. So it's got to bring joy to your heart to know that you're responsible for that.
I fell into it many years ago and haven't been able to get out of it. So it's been a pleasure talking to you. And
all right. Well, thanks so much. And you keep up the great work.
You bet. You be well.
All right. You too.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching. Remember, hit the like and subscribe button so you can get more videos that can help you and your family take control of your health.